Let us begin with a question that almost nobody in Washington thought to ask before the bombs fell in late February. Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz? It sounds like the kind of question you would find in a freshman geopolitics textbook. Obvious, almost embarrassing to raise, and yet the most powerful military planners on Earth, sitting in the most well-funded national security apparatus in human history, appear to have never seriously gamed out the answer, or if they did, they dismissed what they found. And that dismissal, that breathtaking combination of arrogance and strategic illiteracy, is the thread you have to pull if you want to understand how the United States ended up in a position where its vice president is flying to Switzerland to negotiate terms with a country it thought it had already broken. Let me explain what I mean. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the economic jugular of the modern world. Roughly 20% of all global oil supply passes through that narrow channel. Every tanker moving petroleum from the Persian Gulf to Europe, to Asia, to American allies and American markets must pass through it. Iran sits on one bank, and Iran has missiles, a lot of them. Sophisticated ones that have proven in the weeks and months since this war escalated that they can reach American military bases scattered across the Gulf region, ones that can and did reach Israeli targets, ones that quietly, devastatingly altered the entire balance of what was supposed to be a quick and surgical American victory. The puzzling thing, the thing that historians will argue about for decades, is that none of this was secret. Iran's missile capabilities were well documented. Iran's geographic position astride the strait was not a surprise. And yet, when the decision was made to escalate militarily in February, the dominant theory of victory inside the American national security establishment was that air power alone could knock Iran out of the fight in days before any of these asymmetric cards could be played. The Strait would never even become relevant, because the war would be over before Iran could shut it down. This is what military strategists sometimes call a theory of victory built on a single optimistic assumption. When that assumption collapses, so does everything else. The assumption collapsed almost immediately. Within the first days of the conflict, as it became clear this would not be a repeat of the 12-day skirmish from the prior June, which itself had ended with the Israelis quietly relieved to stop fighting, the Iranians began to understand something they had not fully grasped before the shooting started. They were holding a remarkably powerful hand. The Strait gave them economic leverage over the entire industrialized world. Their missiles gave them the capacity to inflict serious damage on adversaries who had assumed they were untouchable. And their willingness to actually use both of these tools transformed what Washington had envisioned as a brief, punitive expedition into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. There is a certain dark irony here that deserves to be named. The Iranians, by most accounts, did not fully understand their own strength on the eve of the war either. They were not sitting in Tehran on February 27th, calmly confident that they would outmaneuver the Americans. They were, like everyone else, operating with incomplete information and imperfect foresight. The difference is that once the war began, and they began to understand what they had, they used it. The Americans and Israelis, by contrast, seem to have remained committed to a narrative of inevitable victory, even as the evidence on the ground told a different story. This is one of the more consistent patterns in the history of modern American military adventurism. The gap between the official narrative and the battlefield reality tends to widen steadily, quietly, until it becomes impossible to maintain. And then the reckoning comes, not in the form of an honest accounting, but in the form of a frantic search for an exit. That exit is now being negotiated in Switzerland, and the terms from everything that can be pieced together amount to a significant capitulation to Iranian demands. The economic catastrophe that the Strait of Hormuz closure threatened, and to some extent continues to threaten, given that the strait remains only partially open, as of this conversation has concentrated the minds of American decision-makers in a way that no amount of strategic analysis apparently managed to do beforehand. There is something worth pausing on here. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which exists precisely for moments of supply disruption, has limits. The Commercial Petroleum Reserve has limits, and when the global economy begins to feel the sustained pressure of constricted oil supply, the political consequences are not abstract. They are felt at petrol stations, in food prices, in the cost of manufacturing and transport, in the quarterly earnings of every company that moves physical goods across the world. This is not a theoretical concern. It is an immediate one, and it is the reason that the American position in these negotiations has moved steadily and unmistakably toward accommodation. The question that hangs over all of this is what Israel does next. Israel's position in this conflict is genuinely peculiar, and understanding it requires stepping back from the immediate headlines and thinking about the structural situation the country finds itself in. Israel is a small, militarily capable state that has, over the past several decades, become deeply dependent on American support. This was not always the case. In the early decades of Israeli statehood, and certainly among the Zionist pioneers before 1948, there was a strong ideological commitment to self-reliance. The understanding was that in an anarchic world where no state can ultimately be trusted to protect another, Israel had to be able to protect itself. American support was welcome, even sought, but dependence on it was understood to be a strategic vulnerability. That principle has eroded significantly. The wars Israel has been able to wage, the scale of force it has been able to project, the assassination campaigns it has been able to sustain across the Middle East, the operations in Gaza, in Lebanon, the ongoing occupation infrastructure, none of it would be sustainable without American military aid, American diplomatic cover, and American willingness to absorb the reputational costs of association. Israel has become, in a structural sense, a client state that behaves like a regional hegemon. The contradiction at the center of this entire arrangement is no longer hidden beneath diplomatic language or political theater. It is becoming visible to everyone. When the President of the United States openly warns that the continuation of this conflict could trigger severe economic consequences, and when senior American officials are personally engaged in urgent de-escalation efforts, it sends a powerful message. It means the patron has begun to question the actions of its closest client. It means Washington increasingly believes that the strategic adventure it once tolerated has moved beyond acceptable limits and entered dangerous territory. The more difficult question is whether the Israeli leadership fully understands the significance of this shift and, perhaps even more importantly, whether it possesses the political capacity to respond rationally to it. The signals emerging from certain parts of Israeli political life suggest that the answer to both questions remains deeply uncertain. Consider the implications of senior officials publicly advocating that all of Lebanon should be treated as a legitimate military target. Consider the normalization of language that borrows heavily from concepts associated with collective punishment and total war. In many political systems, rhetoric of this nature would be regarded as extreme and politically disqualifying. Yet, in this case, it has increasingly become one voice among many in an accepted national debate. These are not fringe figures speaking from the margins of society. These are influential political actors whose support is often essential to the survival of the current governing coalition. This reality points toward an uncomfortable conclusion. The problem cannot be reduced to the personalities of a few leaders. Removing individual figures from positions of power would not automatically correct the deeper strategic and political culture that has developed over many years. Polling data concerning public attitudes toward the conduct of the war, the treatment of civilian populations, and the expansion of military operations suggests that the median opinion within society is often not dramatically different from the positions taken by its most hardline political representatives. In many respects, the extremism being observed is not a distortion of public sentiment. It is a reflection of it. How did this happen? That is the question serious scholars and analysts of Israeli society will be forced to confront in the years ahead, and it is a question that offers no easy or comfortable answers. Decades of continuous conflict have created a deeply rooted psychology of siege. Societies that live under the constant expectation of threat often develop narratives that are extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, even when the strategic realities around them begin to change. Over time, a belief can emerge that the entire world is fundamentally hostile and that criticism of state policy is merely a disguise for deeper animosity. Such a mindset creates what analysts call a closed epistemic system, a political and psychological environment in which genuine self-criticism becomes nearly impossible. At the same time, Decades of unconditional support from a powerful ally can unintentionally undermine strategic discipline. States often behave more cautiously when they know they must personally bear the consequences of their decisions. However, when there is always a patron willing to absorb economic, diplomatic, or military costs, the natural constraints on behavior begin to weaken. The incentive structure changes. Risk calculations become distorted. The result is a political culture that, according to many observers, has gradually lost some of its capacity for sober and realistic strategic calculation. This is not because the individuals involved are unintelligent or incapable. Rather, it is because the mechanisms that normally correct strategic mistakes, real costs, political accountability, and meaningful consequences have been muted for so long that they no longer function effectively. This brings us to the negotiations currently taking place behind closed doors. Stripped of diplomatic language and public statements, the American position appears relatively straightforward. The war must end because its economic consequences have become intolerable. The continuation of hostilities threatens energy markets, international trade routes, and broader global economic stability. The proposed framework reportedly includes an Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon and a cessation of extensive bombing campaigns. In return, Iran has signaled a willingness to move toward fully reopening the strategic maritime passage that has become central to the crisis. The logic behind this arrangement is fundamentally transactional. Remove the conditions that provide leverage, and the leverage itself disappears. Yet the complication lies in the fact that important elements within the Israeli government appear deeply resistant to such an arrangement. Their resistance is not necessarily cynical or performative. Many genuinely believe that any compromise represents surrender, that the war can still achieve favorable outcomes, and that the costs currently being endured remain acceptable. By most objective military and economic measures, this belief appears increasingly disconnected from reality. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that beliefs do not need to be accurate to become politically powerful. Leaders and societies often continue pursuing strategies long after evidence suggests those strategies have become unsustainable. The American response to this resistance may ultimately prove decisive. One possible future sees Washington applying sufficient pressure through public statements, private diplomacy, and economic leverage to compel a strategic shift. The domestic political environment in the United States has changed considerably in recent years. Public opinion has evolved, and there is arguably greater political space for an American administration to pressure Israel than existed only a few years ago. Another possibility is far darker. The internal political dynamics of the Israeli coalition may prove stronger than external pressure, causing negotiations to collapse and extending the conflict further. The consequences of such a failure would likely be severe and widely distributed, affecting regional security, global markets, and international political alignments. Questions of responsibility and blame would quickly become central political issues in multiple countries. What makes this moment historically significant is that it represents far more than another diplomatic dispute. It may mark an inflection point in one of the most important strategic relationships of the modern Middle East. For decades, unconditional American support for Israeli military operations has been treated almost as a permanent feature of the international system, something so deeply embedded that policymakers rarely considered the possibility of meaningful change. But crises have a way of making hidden costs visible. The economic disruptions caused by this conflict have exposed the true price of that relationship in ways that could not easily be ignored. This does not mean the alliance is ending, nor does it suggest that American support for Israel will disappear. Rather, it may indicate that the terms of that support are quietly being renegotiated. Major relationships often change, not through dramatic declarations, but through gradual adjustments that become necessary when old assumptions can no longer be sustained. History offers many examples of such transitions. Formal alliances often persist long after the realities that created them have changed. The language of solidarity and partnership remains intact, while the practical meaning of those relationships slowly evolves beneath the surface. Something similar may be unfolding today. The rhetoric of the special relationship will likely continue. The public affirmations of shared values and strategic partnership may remain unchanged. But the practical meaning of unconditional support, The assumption that one partner can act without meaningful constraints because another will always absorb the consequences may be undergoing a profound and lasting transformation. Whether this shift ultimately changes the trajectory of the region remains uncertain. The forces driving conflict in the Middle East are deep, complex, and deeply entrenched. Yet moments like this create windows of possibility. They expose realities that are often hidden during more stable periods. They force policymakers to confront costs that can no longer be ignored. The question is whether the leaders involved possess the clarity, courage, and political capacity to use this moment to create something durable, or whether the window will close, allowing familiar patterns to return once the immediate crisis passes. That uncertainty, perhaps more than anything else, defines the significance of the present moment.